finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of BS Free MD with your hosts, Doctors Tim and May Hindmarsh. And we have a special returning guest, a favorite of ours, Dr. Harvey Risch. He is an epidemiologist and professor emeritus at the Yale School of Public Health. For those of you who don't know who he is or haven't tuned in the past, which you should have.
Well, then stop wasting your life.
He's been a vocal advocate for critically examining the COVID-19 vaccines. And his latest book, which he's going to be here to talk about, called Toxic Shot, Facing the Dangers of the COVID Vaccines, is co-authored with Dr. Byram Bridle and features a foreword by by Senator Ron Johnson. It's already making waves and has hit #1 in epidemiology. This book uncovers the significant health risks posed by these shots, backed by abundant scientific research. And it doesn't just challenge the narrative, it shatters it. And Dr. Risch, we're so happy to have you back again on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be with you again.
Yeah, it's always fun when you're here. Let's start off right away. Okay, what inspired you? I mean, do we even have to ask to write Toxic Shot? I love the title.
Well, so we've been in the milieu, the so-called countercultural milieu of skepticism about everything that the public messaging has represented about how to treat early outpatient COVID, what the mortality rate was, about the vaccines, about social distancing, about mask wearing. All of this stuff was basically bogus. What was represented to us was bogus and done for various points that needed to be done from the point of view of the national security state, the pharma industry, and the people who are invested at the top levels of those institutions. And so and I count myself among the whole population as the victims of these policies, got increasingly frustrated over the years of the pandemic about so much that was false, because we had been spending all our time dealing with the science. I've got maybe 2,000 or 3,000 files on my computer of papers, scientific papers published or preprint in COVID, and I've read almost all of them at one time or other. Don't ask me to remember anything from this point, but it's a huge body of material to have gone through and to have come to conclusions about the way nature operates in with this virus or these viruses and their control. And because of that, getting increasingly frustrated, we wanted to set out what we thought were the scientific data, studies, opinions based on all of the research that's been done, not on the basis of messaging that needs to support certain actors in the pandemic. And so that's what we did, is we got together a number of those of us who've been collaborating on and talking about different scientific topics in COVID. And we covered almost all of them that we thought should be covered in a book to cover what the possible things the vaccines do. And that's how the book came about.
So does it just focus on the COVID-19, or do you throw in any of the other ones along the way?
No, it really is about the SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, and the vaccines. I would say that a lot of the problem with a new disease, or a seemingly new disease, is that in the absence of a whole body of literature on it, you're forced to think about things at the level of biological theories, not just empirical data. The empirical data occur, but they take time to mature. And people who do these studies, they take, you have to get patients, you have to measure things and analyze it and so on. It takes some time. And I, as an epidemiologist, I like biological theories and medical theories. I just don't believe them, at least not until I have empirical studies to support the theories. The theories are explanations, but they aren't necessarily right. In fact, most theories are wrong in some respects, and some are very wrong. But the idea is, what can you demonstrate empirically that essentially provides strong evidence that a theory you've been entertaining is useful or believable? And so a lot of the stuff that we've been led to believe, things like social distancing, that 6 feet is a magic distance, that if somebody is sick but you're 6 feet away, that you won't catch it, or that masks do something. As I've alluded, I said, it's the masks for respiratory viruses are like mosquitoes being protected by a chain link fence, that, you know, we're orders of magnitude off in the efficacy of masks for source control. And things like that we've had policies that were counterproductive, that dealt with and used people's fear as a means for controlling public behaviors. And lockdowns was another thing that was totally useless and counterproductive and damaging. And so all of these things went into our understanding of how to write chapters for this book. So some of the chapters are more theoretical. For example, the chapter on cancer talks about potential cancer-related mechanisms on how cancers occur. And do we have empirical knowledge of that? Very little at this point. We know that cancers have been occurring, and to some degree in excess, but it's too soon to be doing any real believable studies about a systematic effect of the vaccination on cancer occurrence. So at this point, that chapter is more theoretical than empirical. It's based on knowledge of cancer in a general way, and how COVID and infections and so on plays into that, but it's not empirically supported because those studies haven't been done yet. Other of the chapters have better empirical data and so on. And that's kind of how I look at it, that we tried to do the best with what we had at the time when this was being worked on.
I want to challenge you a little bit, because I'm thinking and I could be way off here, but you said as someone who, likes the numbers and the data instead of just the theories, is that hard for you to write that chapter on on the cancer potential numbers, because it's based off sort of theoretical workings of what happens? Or I guess in your experience with looking at information from the past, do you think it's a good enough extrapolation to make so that you feel comfortable enough putting that in the book?
Well, that chapter was written by Dr. Jane Orient, who has a much deeper biological, molecular biology knowledge of cancer etiology than I do as an epidemiologist. I would say that it's very difficult to extrapolate from previous knowledge about infectious diseases and cancer, because each infectious disease has its own predilections, so to speak. That, I've worked with Helicobacter pylori and GI cancers, and everyone, we know that Helicobacter is associated with stomach cancer, with gastric cancer. But my original interest was in pancreatic cancer, and in fact, it's associated with pancreatic cancer, but it has two opposite associations. One is the kind of Helicobacter that contains the CAG-A positivity. This is a virulence antigen on the surface of the bacterium that causes the bacteria to migrate from the duodenum to the body of the stomach and shut off stomach acid. That colonization is associated with decreased risk of pancreatic cancer, and that's what you see mostly in China, where that's the flavor of the Helicobacter that circulates there. Whereas in the United States, we have a 50-50 mix of CAG-A positive and CAG-A negative strains, and the CAG-A negative strains are associated with increased risk because of a mechanism that I postulated 20 years ago about the pancreas's response to the excess acidity in the stomach. And so you can have all sorts of different things happening. Esophageal cancer, Helicobacter reduces risk of esophageal adenocarcinoma, no relationship to risk of esophageal squamous carcinoma, and so on. So every bacterium, every virus can have unique relationships to every organ that it affects. And so there's really little way to be able to extrapolate from previous other, even respiratory viruses like influenza. It depends on, whether it's H3, H5, H7. Each one of those has its idiosyncrasies. Some are virulent, some are not, and so on. So I think extrapolating is very difficult, really.
So one thing, I just got my copy of the book yesterday. One thing I really want to get out of this, because it drives me completely crazy, and is this whole concept, and we've had these debates even in our own family, where okay, well, my cousin got myocarditis, or my neighbor got myocarditis. It was COVID. It wasn't the vaccine. And so I heard a pretty good podcast from the Canadian COVID Coalition kind of debunking a lot of these studies. But the counter narrative to the shots causing these problems is, this article that just came out in People magazine today, which is, get all your boosters, because if you're boosted, you have less chance to get long COVID. I don't even know what long COVID is. I mean, it's sort of like the Sasquatch disease. I think that it's potentially real. I know it's real in some patients, but you feel crummy after 2 weeks after a virus, and that's long COVID. I mean, that's just long ridiculous. So
no, it's long COVID is having a prolonged cough that doesn't go away after 2 months, and something like that. And it's not long COVID; it's long viral illness. And
yeah, but that
other
happens.
viruses do that.
That's 75% of the people I see in urgent care. They come in because they can't stop coughing, and I'm like, well, you have a post-viral cough. It's a common occurrence. So what do you say to the other side that says, myocarditis, brain fog, pick your spike protein side effect du jour, that it really, like, what's the evidence that it's actually the vaccine and not the virus?
Okay, well, it's easy enough to sort this out. There was a study published recently, might have been yesterday, though I just crossed my desk yesterday, and I admit I don't remember which country. It's a national study. It had 6 million or 9 million people in it, in a cohort study, looking at vaccinated by the mRNA vaccines and serious adverse events. Now, what they were looking for, according to the title of this, was autoimmunity diseases. And so they pieced them out individually, lumped them together. They showed a small increased risk for one of them and no increased risks for most of the others. And quietly in this paper, they also happened to look at myocarditis, pericarditis, and so on. And myocarditis, by vaccination status, had a risk of, I think it was 7-fold or 8-fold increased risk. It was seen in both males and females. It was seen for both types, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, both of them. It was seen in people under age 40 and as well as people over age 40 at the start of follow-up. So pericarditis was there, but a lesser risk on the order of 2.5 or 3-fold. And this is a replication of a known finding, but the magnitude of this relative risk is large, showing a causal relationship in the association. So this is real. Again, because myocarditis is not that common, in people in general, a 10-fold risk is still in the relatively uncommon stage of things. So this is not an acute anxiety situation. Nevertheless, it's real, it's there, it does cause it. And this analysis, of course, accounts for whether people had COVID or not, because almost everybody's had COVID anyway, both vaccinated and unvaccinated. So this is looking at vaccinated versus non-vaccinated people. Yes, there are other circumstances in their lives that cause them to choose to be vaccinated or not. The authors controlled for all that stuff. They did lengthy risk factor matching to predict the fact of vaccination. And so they matched the vaccinated and unvaccinated people that way very closely. And that's how they followed them up and can assert that with adjustment for all these other potential confounding variables, that myocarditis risk was raised some 7 or 8 or 9-fold. And so that's real, and you can't argue that it was COVID that did it, because the COVID was about equal on both sides. The CDC does periodic sero-survey studies of blood donors and to look at antibodies for COVID-19 for the viral envelope proteins as well as the spike protein antibodies. And what they found is that as of the fourth quarter of last year, more than 87% of Americans have had COVID. And that's not astonishing to me because I know how infectious epidemics work over time, but it refutes the idea that anything we did to prevent the spread of COVID had any efficacy. If 87% of the population's had, and it's probably closer to 100 by now, if that large of a fraction of the population's had COVID, then what was the point of all of the interventions that paralyzed the country, damaged many people's lives, damaged people's schooling, damaged children's educations, and all that stuff? The economic and health costs of the interventions that we did for managing the pandemic were never figured into the costs of the pandemic. And from a public health viewpoint, that's malpractice. That pandemic management must involve not just protecting people from the disease, but protecting them from what you inflict on them as well. And that has to be worked out, and it never was. So what you can see is that none of this stuff ever worked. And I think I'm getting tangential here, but you get the idea that the vaccines were very clearly responsible for this relationship in the study, not the COVID itself, because of the findings in the study.
I think that's always the hardest, I would say, point not to argue or prove in a discussion with someone is to say that you can separate out people that have been infected, I guess, versus not. But you're right. If most of the population has already been infected then with COVID, then how do you discern whether it was the virus that caused the, back to the myocarditis?
Well, when it's 700% more in the vaccinated group than the unvaccinated group, everyone has had, essentially everybody's had COVID. So that's out of the picture. So what you would expect to see if it wasn't the vaccine is both groups would be about the same.
Yeah.
They aren't. They're vastly different.
That's essentially, what you're saying, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So and that's the problem. The other thing that I always go back to, which again, maybe I'm too easily irritated, is there was flashes of reality at the very beginning of the pandemic. When Fauci said, well, you could wear a mask, but it's going to catch a droplet or two, but it's not going to, he understood what was going on. And I had started reading about respiratory vaccines really early. And I came to this conclusion as, just a bumbling country doctor, there's some stuff that's really hard to vaccinate against, like RSV. They tried in 1969, it caused antibody dependent enhancement. And it's not because necessarily the vaccine was terrible technology. It's because of the nature of the virus. Well, coronaviruses seem to be just like that. Plus, you're sticking something in somebody's arm where the only chance in the world it has of preventing spread is if everyone gets this wild viremia, which most people get a cold. So they don't necessarily have much of a viremia. They have mostly upper respiratory symptoms. And so this is just common sense kind of virology 101. And I know these guys had to know this. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, they were kind of going down the line of what they had originally planned, which is, you keep people working, you isolate the people that could potentially die from this. And then it all switched. What was that? March 12th, it was just all switched. And it was like, nope, we're taking control of the entire society. And do you have any thought on where the hell that came from? Because it was just, it just seemed to go completely against what common sense in virology was.
Yes. Almost all of the management was against medical and public health and epidemiology common sense. So I think it switched about a week after the declaration of the pandemic emergency that President Trump offloaded the management to the National Security Council. This was known already in 2020, but people didn't know what to make of that. However, it was everything that they did was more or less opposite to what was recommended in the 2006, I think it was, paper by Inglesby and Don Henderson that was published on management of respiratory epidemics. And they said, you don't lock down the population. You basically quarantine people who are symptomatic and until they get better, and you let them go back. You don't close down airports. Mask wearing is useless, and so on. They laid out the public health management at a time when influenza was the worry, and I don't know whether that was ignored or disputed. I don't think there was anything. I think it was more ignored. And it was rejected when the National Security Council took over management of the pandemic and did everything backwards to what Inglesby and Henderson had said. Now, I think there's a reason for all this. And I think the reason goes back to the fact that they knew that this was a man-made virus, that they knew it came out of Chinese laboratory. They knew that the Chinese didn't invent it, but it was invented by Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, or at least by his techniques of genetic manipulation of viruses, and that he had taught his techniques to Chinese researchers in his lab who went back to China and taught their colleagues, and then proceeded to spend 2 or 5 years working on coronaviruses to get them to be human-to-human transmissible. And that's exactly what they did based on Barrick's teaching. So we are culpable for this virus, not just the Chinese. And then whether it leaked out accidentally or intentionally is difficult or impossible to know. But nevertheless, that is the origin of the virus for all of the scientific evidence that we have so far. So this was a man-made virus. Now, think about this. In 1975, President Ford signed the Bioweapons Act. And in that act, we pledged not to develop offensive bioweapons, along with other countries that signed this Bioweapons Act. And there was a loophole, though, in that act. And the loophole was that you can have small stockpiles of offensive bioweapons for the purpose of making countermeasures, in particular vaccines. And so our bioweapons industry exploited that loophole whole hog. They went free and wild in doing bioweapons research, generating toxic viruses, if not bacteria. We have anthrax and all other things going on, and who knows where that, or arose from. In any event, so we've been doing this research with the premise that it was for defensive purposes, to develop countermeasures. That is the lip service. Well, when the COVID pandemic broke and got into the public, there was no vaccine developed. In fact, there haven't been any vaccines developed for any of this bioweapons research since 1975. Sure, we've had vaccines developed, but not on the basis of the bioweapons research that was all predicated on developing vaccines. So there was an intelligence community, national security community crisis, that once the public realized that we spent half a century making offensive bioweapons, violating the treaty, that there would be a public clamor to stop all the bioweapons research. And so the 50,000 scientists and technicians and whatever all involved in this faced the prospect of maybe not having a job when all of this stuff gets closed down. That was the risk. So in order to counter that, the National Security Council basically said, you got to show a vaccine as a result of this research. So the production of the vaccines was done as quickly as possible in order to get something out that the security community could point to and say, see, we might have developed this virus, but we did it so that we would have the vaccine to protect against it. Well, the horse is out of the barn, and suddenly they're coming, with the fire extinguishers. Anyway, but so the vaccine was the countermeasure to show that the bioweapons research was justified. So therefore, the vaccines had to be widely applied to everywhere in order to provide evidence that this was the end result of why they were doing the research in the first place. This is my understanding of the whole circumstance. I can put on my tinfoil hat if you like, but the whole point of this is that there was a large industry motivation for the vaccines to come out and to suppress every other form of treatment in order to establish the vaccines as the end result of this policy. And so even though hydroxychloroquine would have worked outstandingly well for the first 2 years, keeping people from dying, keeping people from getting hospitalized, and ivermectin to almost the same degree in that time period. They were suppressed not because they would have cost pharma, billions of dollars, because costing $1 a day for treatment instead of $1,200, for Paxlovid or whatever, is an economic calamity. And so, but that was my original thinking, but I don't think that's the real reason. I think the real reason was the bioweapons industry threat and how that had to be protected at all costs.
I think you are 100% correct. And the reason is this, from my perspective, so we had a small clinic in Oregon, and we were treating tons of people with monoclonal antibodies. And if you had the right monoclonal antibody for the right strain of COVID, it worked fabulously well. So Big Pharma could have still made a ton of money. They could have been the heroes of treating people early with monoclonal antibodies. We could have set up, monoclonal antibody clinics in 7-Elevens, for heaven's sakes. It was not, they were very well tolerated. They were very clean drugs. So pharma could have still made a lot of money and treated a lot of people early. They didn't do that. They went straight into this vaccine thing. And so there has to be another motive other than money. And I agree with you. I think it's this, they had to show that they did this for a reason. The thing I don't understand is I don't understand why they're still pushing the vaccine. It's still on the pediatric vaccine, chart or whatever. And, I've had patients I've seen in the last week that are on their 6th or 7th or 8th shot. So they're still advertising this. They're still selling this. And I don't get it, because if there's obvious, good data that it's harmful, you would think that they would just say, hey, it worked. We saved everyone. We don't need it anymore. And try to memory hole this thing. The harder they push this, the more people are going to have side effects, the more they're going to realize it. And then they put themselves at grave legal jeopardy. I just don't understand it.
Well, big lies are like spike protein. They take forever to go away.
I love that.
That's wonderful.
That's excellent. I love that one.
I think that, look at how many people are still wearing masks while they're driving alone in their cars. People are very highly irrational, and these things can stay around and now, of course, there's a money motivation for the companies to keep pushing this. But if they said, we don't need this anymore, people would start asking, well, did we ever need it? Exactly. At what point did we not need it? And so on. So they're just pushing the same failed lie.
Yeah.
Astonishing.
They'd have to backpedal big time, for sure.
Yeah. It's like my buddy whose wife used to always show up on Thursday nights, which was her Friday. She'd come home at Friday morning at 3:30 in the morning, just because she went out for a couple drinks with the girls. Whoopsie. That didn't turn out well. You just keep pushing the same lie, and people, if they believe it once, I guess they just keep believing it. That tends to be what I witness in just even regular relationships.
Yes. Unfortunately, it's human nature.
So I want to get into the meat of the book data that's in there as far as findings. And can you speak to what you and Dr. Bridle mentioned as like the big potential side effects of these vaccines that really stood out, and most concerning ones?
Well, this is a difficult question. And the reason it's a difficult question, one thing, I keep telling myself I'm going to have to write this essay on what I call the bridge problem. That these vaccines, more so than other vaccines, but all to a certain degree, and medications in general can do this, is that they have untoward, damaging side effects, adverse effects, but they're not all that common. So that means that, if it's 1% or a few percent or a 1/10%, we can argue about the amount, but the idea is that for most people, the vaccines seem to be relatively safe. So one side of this argues that these vaccines are safe. The other side says, well, look, if you vaccinate 300 million people, multiply that by 1% or 1/10%, and you're going to have hundreds of thousands to millions of people who are damaged from them. So this is what I say the bridge problem is. An engineer designs a bridge over a river and it's built, and he shows that it's 99.999% safe. So people are driving across this bridge every day, and he's very pleased with himself. He thinks that's remarkably safe, until somebody points out that, well, actually 100,000 cars go across the bridge every day, and that means at that level of safety, one car goes into the river day in, day out. And so the people consider this to be the dangerous bridge, because every day somebody dies in the river. And even though it's 99.999% safe. But if you ask people, well, but if you had to go to the post office on the other side of the river, would you go? And they say, sure, it's 99.999% safe. Nothing's going to happen to me on average. That would be my expectation. It's only the people who have to go back and forth every day, who have to do that for 10 years or longer, who then that risk starts to build up until it's no longer 99.999% safe. So that's the question. How do you value the safety and benefit for the great majority of people versus the serious and possibly mortal harms for a small but non-zero segment, when you're giving this to people population-wise who almost entirely are at low risk if they didn't take it? So you can see that this requires a quantitative risk-benefit calculation. You need to know, is it 99.999% safe, or 99.9% safe, or 99% safe, or 98 or 90? You need to know that in order to do a calculation to say, is the damage that it causes less objectionable to the society than the harms that it prevents? And this has never been done for COVID, for the vaccines. It's difficult to do at best. And one can see already, though, that because we know, first of all, in the Omicron period, that the COVID is dramatically less virulent than it was in the first 2 years or so of the pandemic. And secondly, that for almost everybody under age 70, that unless you have some serious comorbidities or major obesity, that your risk of dying is virtually zero from COVID. And so there's no point in taking something that has more or less any systematic hazard when your risk of dying from the alternative is essentially zero or close to zero. And so we should have already figured out that this vaccine should have been directed only, and this is on original grounds at the beginning of it, should have been directed only at elderly people, people with serious comorbidities, even younger ones, but with serious comorbidities, including major obesity and cardiovascular disease, cancer history, immune-compromised diseases, chronic renal disease. We know the whole range of things that puts people at increased risk. But for almost everybody, normal people under age 70, say, there was no benefit from being vaccinated and only risk. And it can be argued that the same even applies for people over age 70 today, but that's a more subtle question, and again requires quantitative information.
So do you think it ever worked? Do you think that first, because my personal belief is that first 3 to 6 months when we started vaccinating people, it probably made a difference at that point. And I remember having this exact conversation with May. I said, this could have saved who knows how many people and still be the worst public health policy in the history of mankind. Both of those things can be true at the same time. It could have worked for 3 to 6 months and then not worked and now just basically be poison. That's what I think.
I think that's how I would represent it. But there's a discussion here, which is, what do you mean by worked? So I think that the vaccines in the first 6 months that they were out did prevent people from getting COVID to a large degree. But as we found out by April of 2021, CDC was collecting information on so-called breakthrough cases, people who had been vaccinated who got COVID anyway. And they collected this throughout 2021. In May of 2021, they said, we're only going to collect data on people who've been hospitalized or died who were vaccinated. So they cut their numbers by a factor of 4 or 5, probably. Nevertheless, by the end of December, more than 4% of vaccinated people had breakthrough infections. So they knew that it was not preventing transmission. Now, as you recall, all of the COVID mandates, all the employment mandates and school mandates and all this stuff was predicated. Every one of those mandates says somewhere in the text of the mandate, whereas this, whereas that, whereas to prevent the spread of COVID, and we're requiring people to be vaccinated. So all of these mandates were predicated on a goal of reducing transmission of the infection. And yet, the vaccines not only were never studied for effects on transmission, they were never approved for use to prevent transmission. In the EUAs that the FDA granted, the emergency use authorizations for the vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, they say the wording is that these vaccines are approved to prevent infection. That's it, period. So what does it mean by infection? Well, the only person who can be prevented of infection is a person who gets vaccinated, because the FDA never had any study data on transmission. All of the randomized trials that were done by the manufacturers that were provided to the FDA for the FDA's approval process, all of them studied only infections in the people in the trials. So only the vaccine people and the placebo people were the ones who had information about whether they got infected. And that's what the FDA used. So the FDA had no information about transmission of the infection. And therefore, when it says to prevent infection, it's only talking about people who themselves took the vaccines, not transmission. And the FDA law says that products approved by FDA cannot be marketed for purposes other than for which they have been approved. Now, doctors use things off-label all the time, but they can't market them, they can't represent them. They can only tell patients, I think this would help you in your individual case. And that's how they can use off-label products. But mandates and recommendations at that level is a marketed claim of efficacy against transmission for which the products had not been approved, and that was actually illegal. So all of the mandates are, technically speaking, in legal terms, illegal, because you cannot market things for unapproved reasons, and that's what we've been led to believe, that every one of these mandates is to prevent spread. Well, did the vaccines prevent spread? Probably a little bit during the first 6 months, but by the time breakthrough infections were happening, that they're no longer preventing spread. And so by the end of fall of 2021, when most of the employment and school mandates were beginning to be in full force, everybody should have known, because the CDC had made it public, that there was so much breakthrough infection that vaccinated people were no longer preventing the spread by their being vaccinated. And the remarkable thing about this is that even if you take the FDA's 4.2% or 4.3% of vaccinated people had gotten breakthrough infections by the end of that year, what this means is that if more than 96% of your workforce or your students have been vaccinated, that even if the remaining 4% of students or employees who haven't been vaccinated, even if they all get COVID, that they, as an identifiable group, would produce less COVID than the 4.3% of the vaccinated employees. And so because of that, you can see that it was totally irrational to think that the unvaccinated people were going to spread COVID, whereas the vaccinated people weren't, because the vaccinated people would be responsible for more transmission than the unvaccinated people.
Well, then they changed the narrative, though, too. They changed the narrative from, there was that whole Rachel Maddow segment. If you get the vaccine dies with you, you will not spread it. I mean, Fauci said that too, the vaccine will end this. And they knew, I mean, I'm sure he knew that there was zero data on transmission, but then they changed the narrative to you have less of a chance of dying. Well, there's been no randomized controlled trials on whether you get less risk of dying if you're vaccinated. And there's, reasonable observational evidence that it may actually increase your risk of dying right now. Am I wrong on that?
No, you're correct on that. But there's I think, a more interesting issue, which is every person has the right to decide on their own medical treatment. The state can't mandate treatments for people for purposes of preventing them from getting sick or dying. If it did, we have a cause of dying that kills 500,000 people a year in the United States, and the state doesn't make people stop smoking, which is the cause of their dying. At that level, 500,000 people aren't dying from COVID year in, year out. So we have a much bigger ticket item to deal with, and yet we don't say anything about that. The state doesn't have an interest in that, just like it doesn't have an interest in keeping people from doing, hang gliding and bungee jumping and driving and riding airplanes and all sorts of things that have whatever degrees of hazard that they have. That we tolerate various kinds of risks in society. We're inured to the risks in society that we take for granted as part of modern life. We make individual decisions to try to cut those risks as best we can. But as a society, we don't paralyze our society in order to protect small amounts of risk that we've grown accustomed to. And so as the state should not legally, ethically, morally be able to mandate that you take a treatment. There is no compelling state interest for that. There is a compelling state interest to prevent transmission to other people who might not be able to protect themselves. That's a state interest. Once that interest disappeared, and don't forget that Rochelle Walensky on August 6th, the head of the CDC, on August 6th of 2021, said in a CNN interview, what the vaccines can't do anymore is prevent spread. So she said it. They knew. They were, this is August of 2021. Everybody should have known and could have known that the vaccines had failed to do what we were led to think they were going to do, which is to suppress the spread of the infection. Now, I've argued that was the wrong thing to even think about in the first place, that the spread of the infection is not how pandemics are managed. It's how you generate fear to control people.
Right.
But that's not how pandemics are managed. They're managed by controlling hospitalizations and mortality. You have to figure out how to prevent hospitalization and mortality in people, not how to prevent infection, because infection almost entirely generates natural immunity. And now there's a couple dozen studies, but even in 2021, there were half a dozen or more studies showing that natural immunity after having had COVID is as durable, if not more so, and as strong at preventing reinfection as the vaccines were in preventing breakthrough infection. And the gist of it is that the infection from natural immunity lasts for about 9 months before it starts to taper off. And that's consistent with everything we know about natural immunity to respiratory infections like flu, RSV maybe, and other things, that immunity isn't perfect. It's strong for a good period of time and then begins to wane to various degrees. And that's no different than the vaccines. In fact, it's probably slightly better than the vaccines. But the fact that such a large fraction of the population has had COVID means that there's so much natural immunity in the population that it drives the infection down to low levels. Not zero, it's still with us, but low levels compared to what it once was. That is the steady state for where COVID is going to be as it continues to mutate and try to escape both natural immunity and vaccine immunity, and will create small little waves, that occur from time to time that come and go and will be of intellectual interest, but not of major public health interest.
So I got a couple of questions here in my brain that I want to get back to. One is the bridge analogy, which I loved. And so based on the numbers, so if someone's driving across the bridge every day, and they have the 1 in 1,000 chance of hitting, or is it, sorry, it's 1,000 people driving across the bridge that hit the water.
1 in 100,000.
Yeah, 1 in 100,000. So a car goes in the bridge. What about the people that cross multiple times, meaning the people that now just haven't gotten one shot, but have gotten 5, 6 boosters? What happens?
I think we're up to 8 or 9 right now.
To their risk for potential side effects or toxicities that you're alluding to in your book? What happens to the numbers in?
Well, we hardly knew the numbers for after 2 or 3 or 4. So after 8 or 9, I don't know. I hope they get a quantity discount on the prices. But honestly, those are people who survived the first 3 or 4, and apparently without too much torture and side effects that allowed them to continue taking more. So maybe they're already self-selected for being able to manage that. We know from the Cleveland Clinic study that looked at, I think, 0, 1, 2, and 3 or more as different exposure levels of vaccination, that the risk of getting COVID increased with each group. So 3 or more was higher risk than having 2, which is higher risk than having 1 vaccine, which is higher risk than not being vaccinated. So that study in the 50,000 Cleveland Clinic employees showed that some years ago. But beyond 3 or more, I don't think there's very much evidence that would pin this down one way or another.
Well,
So
I think how I explain it to people is and the reason it worked, it had some effect on the virus, positive effect on the virus for the first 3 or 4 months, I explain this as, okay, all vaccines are immune modulators. They're supposed to modulate your immune system. So we have 2 common injections we use in primary care to modulate people's immune systems. There's the childhood vaccine schedule. You can get your pneumovax when you're over 60, all of that kind of stuff. And then we have allergy shots. So allergy shots are systemic desensitization. The first time you get a small dose, you have a reaction. You keep doing this. It's on, the IgG4 system or something like that. I can't remember exactly. And they showed the spikes in IgG4 with the COVID shot. And I would contend, based on data like the Cleveland Clinic data, is that we're really now giving people a desensitization allergy shot and not a vaccine at all.
Well, I think that's what they showed, that I forgot whether it was the 3rd shot or the 4th shot, they showed the transition from IgG 1-2 to IgG4, which is the tolerance antibody, an antibody that binds to the virus but doesn't neutralize the virus. And that causes tolerance because the neutralizing antibodies are blocked from binding. And so you're right. This is the immune tolerance versus immune attack difference in our immune system. We have to have immune tolerance to things that are non-toxic that we get exposed to day in, day out. But we don't. But we still have to take out bacteria and viruses and other things that are toxic to us. So there's this balancing system, and the immune system tends to work on its own pretty well for most people. And, and then you come in, and a law of unintended consequences, you eventually, in the idea of taking out repeated attacks by a toxic virus, you build up tolerance to it. So at the same time, however, you're still generating other antibodies to the COVID virus, even if it's to the original one. That's the antibody-dependent enhancement or natural antigenic sin, or however you think of it, that are still working to neutralize the virus, but not as strong once you've gotten to 5 or 10 mutations down the road, that the immunity is not as strong at that point, which is why the viruses are still with us, that even though people have partial immunity, it's not complete. So you get partial immunity from the vaccines. And honestly, I don't know that one has to look at breakthrough infections in people taking their 8th dose. I have no idea whether that happens or not, because there's been no systematic studies from my knowledge.
But I saw somebody last week, and I mean, there was a 6th, 7th, 8th dose, and she comes in and she's like, I think I have COVID because, my son had it or whatever. And I'm like, well, you probably do. And I just sat there. I mean, I didn't say anything because it's, that's not my job in that.
You just looked down and shook your head. That's right.
Yeah. In that environment. But I'm sitting there. I'm like,
you're like, what do you want me to do?
Like, it worked. It didn't work the first 7 times. I mean, this is like getting marriage advice from Elizabeth Taylor. Like,
exactly.
Hello.
Don't do as I do as I say. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it just, it just boggles the imagination. It's like people they go to their, their doctor, and their doctor says, sees whatever the diktat is from the CDC and just regurgitates this without thinking, and the patient accepts it without thinking. I mean, this is the prophets of Baal from, the book of, from the ancient prophets. I'm waiting for Elijah to start calling fire down from heaven because it's so completely irrational.
Well, what unfortunately I've learned over the last 4 years is how irrational people are. Mm-hmm. That people are scared that, there's no other reason why people would wear masks while they're driving alone. The only reason I would think to wear a mask while driving alone is because there's so much marijuana smell in our life today. But
exactly.
That's funny.
Yeah. Well, if it's in your car and the windows are rolled up, though, that's sort of marriage advice from Elizabeth Taylor, but I'll just leave that one there.
Right. So these are totems. These are things that people are doing to reduce their fear, not to actually treat anything or prevent anything.
So back to the reason for calling it toxic shot.
Isn't it hard to not say toxic shock when you're a physician and you've said toxic shock?
I know he did that on purpose.
14 billion times.
Because I keep wanting to say toxic shock.
I know I have that problem too. And in fact, I did some work on toxic shock in trying to analyze the original pandemic back in 1982 after I had finished my PhD in mathematical modeling of infectious epidemics. And I was getting CDC data, and one of the state epidemiologists that I contacted was Dr. Doom and Gloom, Michael Osterholm in Minnesota, who said, there's no point in doing this because half the states aren't reporting their data to the CDC anyway. So the CDC wasn't telling anybody that. Anyway, that's when I changed to doing cancer research.
Oh my God.
So, yes, so I'm well aware of that inability, but we thought this was a great title anyway. In spite of that.
It is an awesome title for sure.
So I'm going to ask, because we touched on the myocarditis, and what about any other things that stand out? Even though we kind of got to the bridge analogy and alluded that the risks are small, but is there any things that you can definitely say that this is toxic and is causing problems? Especially, I'm thinking, infertility, pregnancy risks, or anything else.
I'd say clotting and neurological issues are the next biggest issues. That the spike protein is just toxic on its own, and it gets into the bloodstream and goes around to various organs, including the lining of the bloodstream, and sits there and generates inflammatory spots, foci, and disrupting blood flow. And if you do that, what you get for symptoms is just dependent on which organ the inflammation is in. Mm-hmm. So if it's neurologic, it can get to the brain, it can get to the spinal cord, peripheral nerves, and so on. It does damage there. If it gets to the kidneys, it can do damage there. If it gets to the gut, it can do damage in various of the gut organs. So any of these things can happen, and not just the cardiac problems. And so it's a matter of degree and location. And in addition to the fact that if this is sitting on the lining of the veins and arteries, more likely the veins, that creating inflammation, that the inflammatory response in the bloodstream triggers immune recognition and mediation, which can involve platelets, which can involve clotting. And because of that, you can get clots that form. Clots are supposed to be protective, to seal holes in our blood system, to keep blood from leaking out. Clots are not supposed to form peas and stones and nuggets inside the blood system to get transported and block blood flow somewhere down the line. And so that's the problem with clots, that they can close off arteries or veins and interfere with not just the blood flow to the organ that they're in, but they can move to other places and cause strokes and things like that down the line. Not only that, but the spike protein itself and its inflammation can damage the wall of the bloodstream where it's at. And if that erodes, then you can have major leakage. And if it's in an artery like the aorta, then you can cause aneurysm and hemorrhage, which is life-threatening when that happens. And while these aren't common reactions, they do occur. And this is a problem, again, of the car every day into the river, that somebody is getting affected by that, even though it's not a lot of people. But these are the things that doctors have been observing and we've written about in the book.
Well, yeah, but now it's a no-brainer, because if it actually increases your risk of getting COVID, so it's not doing anything at all at that point, because the whole, well, yeah, but you have less of a chance of dying. Well, actually, you have less of a chance of dying from COVID if you never get COVID in the first place. Duh. So it's completely ineffective. It has obvious risks, and the other side, which is even, I think, more common sense from even 4 years ago, is most of the people that are getting this have virtually zero risk from even, the Alpha or Delta variant. And so
it's probably true. And you don't even feel good after getting the vaccine. There's no, positive experiential benefit.
Yeah, it's not like that. Right. It's not like the half pint of Jack Daniels. At least your regret had some positive aspect to it.
I don't know. Maybe you like pain and getting a jab in the arm.
Well, yeah, but that's a different diagnosis.
So can you tell us a little bit about the foreword from Senator Ron Johnson and the inspiration or the collaboration behind that? Any special story?
Well, Senator Johnson was the force in the Senate to say this COVID management has been irrational, illogical, and damaging. And he, in the very beginning, started having his own panel investigation and documentation of everything that went wrong in how COVID was being managed. He was unable to have Senate votes, Congress votes, or make policies in order to stop doing what we were doing. So instead, he chose to be public and documenting everything that could be observed about it. And that's how he brought me and colleagues to the Senate multiple times, starting in November of 2020, to talk about our experience in COVID treatment and other factors. And while it was frustrating, the other side, the Democratic senators, brought in Dr. Ashish Jha, who then shortly thereafter became head of the Dean of Public Health at Brown University, who wrote an op-ed in New York Times calling us snake oil salesmen of the Senate. And it's really, of course, that was a lie. It was a smear, because everything that we had represented about the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine in preventing hospitalization and mortality used in treating outpatients at that time was true and was justified by multiple major studies to the tune now of about 70,000 patients in those studies showing how good this worked before Omicron, that period when the studies were done. In any event, Dr. Jha recently came out with a statement saying he regretted saying that, because now he's backtracking, because he's seeing more about public discussions about how the pandemic was mismanaged, even from the beginning when he was the mouthpiece of the government.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah, no, it's going to be interesting. I mean, we live. What's isn't that the Chinese curse? May you live in interesting times. Well, we live in interesting times, and it just, like, I am literally at the stage now with what's gone on in the last 3 weeks that if I swear Nancy Pelosi is going to give a speech and she's going to grab her chin and she's going to pull the mask off and she's actually going to be a lizard person.
Yeah, I think she's going to be Klaus Schwab underneath.
Yeah, there's going to be something like that. Like, I tell my friends at work, space aliens could crawl out of a spaceship on my front yard and I just go, yeah, well, I guess it's Wednesday. I mean, it's just, the world is so bizarre right now. So
it's true. It's irrational and untrustworthy that I used to believe in an idealized form of the goals of the United States, which were to be enlightened, to be democratic, to have give and take for political views at a democratic and elected process, that it might not have been perfect in its history, but it seeks or sought to be democratic and meritocratic. And yet, in the past 4 years, not only have we learned that the country has been corrupt for quite some time, but to the degree of, the JFK assassination, which was orchestrated by the CIA and friends, and that we're seeing the same things happen in COVID, that we're living under a fascist dictatorship of the marriage of the so-called public-private cooperation partnership is a fascist control using big industry as a tool to impose economic and social behaviors on the population. And the corruption of the media just cements that, locks that in, that the media have been the only safeguard against a totalitarian government to create public unrest, at least to motivate people to vote against the corrupting government. But if the media are locked into that, then there's not enough public unrest to respond to the corruption and what's going on in the government. And that's largely where we are. To the degree we have alternative media that are reaching half the population now, there's no way we can get out of this without that. That needs to be improved, and perhaps will, at a slow rate, increase general public knowledge of all the corruption that's going on. But we still have the complete loss of trust in the CDC, the FDA, much of Congress and the government, all of the administrative state, and so on, because it's shown how corrupt it's been in all of the decisions and policies that have come out. It doesn't take much to look around and see what's happening at the southern border, what happened in COVID, and various other things. The whole Ukraine war, where we're basically trying to impose NATO on Russia on its border, and then saying, "Oh, it's not us, it's Ukraine." Doesn't anybody think about anything that's happening?
No, I think I think that the Ukraine situation and sticking our finger in Russia's eye is potentially the most dangerous thing going on right now. We tend to be very anthropomorphic as far as Americans and only look at our own issues in the election and all this kind of stuff. But I mean, we launched we said Ukraine did it, but we literally launched cluster bombs on the beach in Russia. Like, can you imagine what our response would be if that Russian sub that was 25 miles off of the coast of Florida would have launched a cluster bomb on Miami Beach on the 4th of July? How would we have responded? And this literally happened, and somehow it was essentially zero reporting and completely memory hold. It's like, eventually, if Putin is a madman, why would you provoke a madman? It doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, this is the issue of plausible deniability. You load the gun and you give it to a psychotic person and you hide behind the desk.
What's exactly what's going on? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't my gun. It was the crazy person's problem. That really terrifies me. And it's just, not to get too political, but whoever is president January 20th, 2025, please just pull the pin on that proxy war and make that go away. And then the second thing you do is get rid of direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising and start.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, this is a much more interesting issue than just propagandizing the general public. That the reason why pharma spends inordinate amounts of money on public lay advertising is for two other reasons. Number one, that it offloads its legal responsibility onto doctors to convey all the information about drugs, because once it makes it public, the general principle is the doctor has to be the one who explains everything to the patient. And so that's why those little statements at the ends of the commercials are so fast and so detailed and so technical. because it's not for people to be able to understand. It's for physicians. That's the first thing. But the more important reason is that it addicts the media to the revenue, to the advertising revenue. And so it corrupts the media and forces the media not to report adverse interests of the pharma companies doing the advertising. And this is a bigger problem because this is not just lay advertising, it's medical journal advertising, and revenue also is addicted. And academics all over the world dealing with the diseases that the drugs are aimed at are also addicted to grants, speaking tour money and all sorts of money to shut them up, basically. That there's so much money that big pharma has that it can spread all this corrupting influence all over the world for all of the academic and media centers to control the narrative about virtually everything. And this is a tantamount to monopoly, and we should have had a government response to cut this, to reduce the effect of this, because this is not free market capitalism in the first place. Yeah. And we kind of do have those laws, but we've never applied the monopoly laws. We've never really applied them at the scale that's needed for the amount of corrupting influence that pharma has now.
Well, and when everyone's bought off, that's the problem.
I wish they had bought off me. They haven't tried.
No, I know.
I was going to say.
I know. It's exactly.
So let's get our listeners to, help support you. Where can they find your latest book?
The book is on Amazon, and all you have to do is on Amazon search for Toxic Shot, and you'll find it.
And voila, it will go into your basket and be at your doorstep the same day.
Yeah, it was like
some locations.
Overnight.
Really, it's overnight? That's great.
Yeah, perfect. Any other current projects you got going on now that the book is out that we can look forward to?
So, I think there's a large amount of COVID fatigue out there in the world, in the US and so on. And I certainly have it after 4 years of fighting all of this. We're not going away. The book is a landmark statement to reassert that we know what you've done and we're coming after you, legally speaking.
Yes.
And that but I think that the general population is a little less inclined to deal with things unless they had been personally affected, like they were forced out of their jobs because of not getting the vaccines and things like that. So there's lots of lawsuits now out of people suing their employers because of that. And that's kind of what the COVID has morphed into at the moment. And I'm not seeing anything of salience for any new bird flu problem or anything else coming up, on November 1st or thereabouts, just before the election.
Let's hope that there's no other thing for you to collect data on.
No,
the problem with this, of course, is that the FDA is doing research on bird flu in its lab in Athens, Georgia, I believe, and it's using mallard ducks as the propagating species to try to get a human-to-human transmissible version. This is a bioweapon research, and mallard ducks, of course, are worldwide. They fly everywhere and will infect everywhere, if they're infected with such a strain. And this is unconscionable bioweapons research that should have been shut down and is still going on, government funded, and it's insane. It's just insane to be doing this bioweapons research.
Somebody has to go to jail before this ends.
When you said that, though, where I grew up, there literally was a duck pond right beside my grandmother's house when I would spend every weekend there. When you go down, take the bread, dried up breadcrumbs, feed the ducks, the mallards. There's a couple of geese.
Yeah,
they're still there, and now we're doing this.
Yeah, and I know it's insane. I just don't understand why we do so much insane behaviors. That these scientists, they're mad. They're insane. They're doing this because they want to be the inventor of the death ray.
Yeah.
So that they can say, I've invented the death ray, and now I'm going to invent the antibody, the solution whatever it is to prevent the death rate. This is all ego career driven for those kinds of people. There is no idealistic, social, responsible reason for generating toxic organisms, because we could never use them in biowarfare because they would blow back on us. We would get it,
right.
shortly thereafter, and they're not necessary, because if somebody inflicts some kind of illness, infection on us, that as an act of war, you don't have to reply in kind. We have economic, other biological, chemical, normal, weapons of war, and nuclear weapons, any and all of which could be used against an adversary depending upon how we are attacked. We don't need to have new biological agents just because they hit us with a biological agent. So the whole idea of developing biological agents for preventing, attacks in war is absurd. It's completely irrational. It's protecting the careers of irrational, insane people is all that it's doing.
Well, it makes you wonder if from our faith tradition, this is a spiritual warfare as far as we're concerned, because it's so beyond the pale of common sense or even greed. I mean, at least greed you can kind of understand. This is just lunacy.
Kind of interesting, because it makes you think about, the First Amendment rights, yet no one really talks about the biological weapons scenario and how to marry those two. So that's interesting. Are you ready for a little diversion of fun before we let you go?
Okay.
I warned you about.
We should have a happy ending. That's right.
That's right.
That's right. We tried and failed miserably.
I know. I'm always like, how can we spin this so it's fun at the end? Okay, so I warned you about these. Here we go. Favorite book you've read this year besides your own?
I think that would be Naomi Wolf's book, Facing the Beast. That the title is, there's a chapter on Facing the Beast, which is her experience with a bear prowling around her house while her husband was off traveling, and her fear that it would come in and attack her. But there's more to it than that, because Facing the Beast really applies to the beast of what the government has done to us during COVID, facing that beast, facing the beast of human nature, what we just spoke about, the evil aspect of human nature, that's a beast that has come to the fore in our experience now, that she's also talking about in that book. So I think this is a very engaging book, and I've liked it a lot.
Awesome. Okay. Are you a morning person or a night owl?
I am an extreme night owl. It's genetic. My mom was too.
Just like your mom.
Yeah, just like I. Yeah, I fight it. I fight it. If you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be?
This is a difficult one. I would say Albert A. Michelson. Michelson was a physicist around the turn of the 20th century who got a Nobel Prize for measuring the speed of light. And he did it with an engineering solution by climbing up to mountains, putting a giant arc light on one mountain, and then 5 miles away on another mountain peak had a motor with a giant wheel with notches around the end, and spun the motor fast enough that the notches would go back. The light from the arc light, actually had the arc light behind him, would go to the other mountain with a mirror and come back, and he could spin the wheel so fast that the notches would begin to block the light coming back, and he knew how fast he was spinning the wheel and the diameter of the wheel. And so from all of that, he could calculate how long it took the light to go to the far end and back, which was brilliant because nobody even knew that light wasn't instantaneous at that point. And he hypothesized that it was not instantaneous and that it was measurable, and he did. And I thought this was a remarkable experiment. And so I like that.
That is.
Wow. That's a great story.
That's trippy.
No kidding. Okay, last one. What's your go-to comfort food?
Chocolate chips and red wine.
I love it.
Yes, that is a wonderful combination.
I would love to get together with you for some chocolate chips and red wine in the future. So for sure, that'll be on our list. All right. Thanks again, Harvey, for being here and sharing your wonderful insights and intellect, and then your new book. And we will post the links for everybody, and they can go to Amazon, of course, too. It's so easy. Type it in. And we love having you on the show and can't wait to have you back again in the future.
This is great. I'm going to try to be less Harvey Downer in the future. But.
Well, enough chocolate chips and red wine.
There you go.
Probably solves that.
Yeah.
Next time we did it all. All right. Thanks again.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks to Harvey, too, for just sharing about his book and his insights. And obviously, everybody, you can get his book now. It's a total must read for anyone concerned about the long-term health implications of these kind of shots. And so also,
we're not calling them vaccines because
I'm changing
really
the word.
aren't.
I'm changing the word. As always, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, leave us a review, and share this episode with anyone who needs to hear the message. And your support brings us more insightful conversations like today's. And we do have a community shout out this week as well.
Yes, this week we're throwing the spotlight on Patty Post from Facebook. Patty, you absolutely nailed it with your recent comment, cheering on our political ventures and keeping the spirit of BS-free MD alive and kicking. You're a legend, Patty. Thanks for having our back and being a powerhouse in our community. We really appreciate that.
All right, everyone. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, keep it BS-free.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS-free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS-free MD. See you next time.
But we try to keep BS-free MD as raw and real as possible. We can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.